Hi guys. So some of you might know. I mean, I've not been around for a while. If you're completely new to this channel, I started off doing music reactions. I've been doing that only for a few years, a couple of years, and it just grew. My aim was never to become a YouTuber. It was something I did for a friend. I kind of reacted to a song he told me to react to, and he said to me during COVID, he said, "That's quite insightful. You should try making a video of that." And I did it, and a few years on, I've got 5,000 subscribers, which I know is not a lot, but it's 5,000 more than I was aiming for. So really show my gratitude. Anyway, I've been so my channel is at a stage where we're kind of going to go into a different area, which is working with a lot of psychologists and theologists and authors of books in psychology and theology. Probably start first 2-3 months of next year we'll really start kicking that off. At the moment I'm doing lots of interviews. It's called a deeper dive. I'm a big fan of Nietzsche. I read a lot of Nietzsche. I try to understand Nietzsche, and I don't understand him, and I think that's why I'm a fan. But even Carl Jung and Freud and Schopenhauer and Immanuel Kant, and going all the way back to Socrates. And one of the books I'm reading at the moment, well, I'm reading a few books right now, well, none of them at the same time, probably way too much than I can handle, but I'm reading Good and Evil. I'm reading Ordinary Men, which is a tough read. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which I've kind of started and I just put it down, and I'll come back to it. And I'm also reading another book. It's a Dummy's Guide to Neurobiology. I think I should put 3 of them down and just focus on one, because I'm not getting any of them. I'm probably taking on a bit too much information, but it's got me really thinking about what led me towards this path. And I've got to, hand on heart, say it was Peterson. I watched a lot of Peterson, even listened to a lot of Peterson podcasts since the days I started running through the COVID time. I started going for jogs, and I'm not a fan of listening to music when I'm exercising, so I used to listen to Jordan Peterson. And since then, 2-3 years on, and lots of running, lots of gardening and doing outdoor activities, and if I got headphones on, I'm usually listening to, well, now it's Pink Floyd or Jordan Peterson. So I've been through almost every single one of his podcasts, and there are over 500 of them, and some of them I've listened to 2 or 3 times. So I'm a big fan of his insight. I know not everyone is, but that's just me personally. So I'm going to do a reaction to something I've not seen, and it is Jordan Peterson talking about things online, and I'm gonna see exactly which direction they're pointing me. You're talking about Jesus Christ, so let's go into that. It's only a 2-minute 40 video. I might stop it at certain points, not to give narration or any perspective into what he's saying or elaboration, but just to tell you what I'm taking from what he's saying. So I'm completely new to this. It's just a snippet of what looks like a long interview, but let's see how we get on.
So you can think about Christ from a psychological perspective, and my critic, this particular critic that I've been reading, said, well, that doesn't differentiate Christ much from a whole sequence of dying and resurrecting mythological gods. And of course, people have made that claim in comparative religion. Joseph Campbell did that, and Jung to a lesser degree, I would say, but Campbell did that. But the difference, and C.S. Lewis pointed this out as well, the difference between those mythological gods and Christ was that there's a representation of, there's a historical representation of his existence as well. Now you can debate whether or not that's genuine.
Okay, I'm going to stop just there, and there's a reason for that. So yesterday I was having a discussion with somebody about really long discussion. It went on to, I'm not a Facebooker, but I have an account because I've got a group on there with over 60,000 members. So I kind of look after it, if you like, which is mainly removing and accepting videos and posts. I don't post anything. I haven't done for over 5 years, but I do have some interesting debates. And I was having one debate with somebody just recently, and it was on about, he was talking about Christ as a real entity. And it was an interesting discussion, and this has been going on for about 9 months. Just me and him just talking on one messenger, and everyone can read it, and people just seem to tune in. And it was not an intention; it just happened that way. And we're very, very respectful of each other. But we started discussing the reality of entity, and my last message to him is, I'm not ever writing my messages. It's just my perspective and ongoing dialogue or conversation was. Even if he wasn't real, and I believe he was, then surely we got to first define what real is, and secondly, you got to kind of, once you define what real is, it's what does real do, right? So, for example, my example to him is when I watch a certain film, like say I watched Schindler's List, right? Okay, it's based on historical accounts. It's actually based on a historical person, Oskar Schindler, but the film in itself, it's been dramatized, it has to be, and the film itself has actors in it naturally. It invokes an emotion, right? It invokes an emotion to me, the observer. It's one of the most powerful films, if not the most powerful film I've ever watched. And the music, and I've actually done a reaction to one of the main theme tune. It's so powerful that it invokes something deep within me of horror and the atrocities that humans can, put on others. And also, it coincides with the book I'm reading, Ordinary Men, which is about how German ordinary men turned into Nazis more or less overnight, and that psychological transition. Not for the faint-hearted, I have to say. It's a tough book to read. But anyway, and when he talks about Christ being real, the emotions are real, aren't they? So even if the stories are real, even if the accounts are real, the emotions are real. And I think the emotions is the story. So how you react to a certain fable or parable or part of, let's say in this case, the Bible, your reaction to that, your feeling, your emotion, your attachment to that is in itself the story, right? Because that does something. It's like, how am I going to explain it? It's like prayer. You don't have to believe in an entity to know that a prayer is sacred, it's holy, because it invokes an emotion. Music does that, right? Now, music was around a lot longer than language, a lot longer. So, you're going back to the phrase "what is real." What you're feeling is real, right? And the most realist thing that you can feel, and I think it was Jung that said it, is pain. Pain is the most real. The extent to a negative feeling has an absolute, and that absolute is death. You can't get more dead than dead, right? So that's the absolute. That's the end of a tragedy, of a pain, of anything that can happen to you worse than death. You would probably invite, right? Again, a lot of Jews, when they were in the Holocaust, and a lot of, I'm not comparing the two, but even a lot of people who are on death row, or people that know they're going to die, they sometimes invite death before the process of death, because they feel living through the pain towards death is worse than death. But how can it be? Right, because death is the ultimate. Whereas on the flip side, on the happiness side, there is no ultimate. There doesn't seem to be a ceiling of happiness or exuberation or joy. There's no too happy. There is too sad or unhappy, which is dead. That's the bottom. That's the end. That's the pinnacle in the other direction. I don't know what you'd call that. Let's think about it as an amplitude. So the worst you can get is death. The best you can get is what? That's why happiness is such a weak, in my opinion, such a weak goal and ambition, is to just be happy. Why not be beyond that? There is no limit to how happy you can be. So what happens when you achieve happiness? Surely you don't just think that's it. You want more of something. And I think the ultimate place you can go is liberation, complete liberation. But anyway, that's going into another territory. So it's interesting what he said already about this video.
you can debate about whether or not he actually lived and whether there's credible objective evidence for that, but it doesn't matter in some sense because this, well, it does, but there's a sense in which it doesn't matter because there's still a historical story. And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I don't know. I'm amazed at my own belief and I don't understand it. Like, because I've seen sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch. That's Jungian synchronicity. And I've seen that many times in my own life. Mm-hmm. And so in some sense, I believe it's undeniable. We have a narrative sense of the world. For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act. It's real. Like, we treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world. But the narrative and the objective world touch. And the ultimate example of that, in principle, is supposed to be Christ. But I don't know what to... that seems to me oddly plausible.
Yeah.
But I still don't know what to make of it. Partly because it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. I don't even know what would happen to you if you fully believed it.
If you believed in the story of Christ, or if you believed that history and let's say the narrative meet, let's
both,
say.
I think you... Because when you believe that, you buy both those stories. You believe that the narrative and the objective can actually touch.
Wow. Okay. So, well, for me anyway, quite thought-provoking. So, it's interesting what he said in so many ways, and it's also interesting that he feels that emotion. Nietzsche, I mean, he obviously, not obvious to everyone who hasn't read Nietzsche, but he wrote a book called The Antichrist, and he very famously, came up with a statement that God is dead, and it excited a lot of atheists. But when he turned his head towards the atheists and says, "Why are you so excited if God is dead? Because if God is dead, that means he must have had to exist, right?" And they're like, "Whoa, okay, so that's a different perspective." It's very interesting that Nietzsche also said, he uses the phrase in one of his books, I think it's Will to Power. He calls them three-quarter Christians, and I think that's just fantastic. And the reason he says three-quarter Christians a lot is because he believed very famously that the only true Christian was Christ. And I think that's so magical, and I don't think that's purposely a discredit to anybody that wants to emulate the virtues of Christ. I think that is testament to them, because we are supposed to be sinners, and therefore we're not supposed to be perfect, because if we were perfect, we won't be here, because we would already be in the unity of God, unified with God, right? Our soul would be one with the Creator. So the very fact that Nietzsche talks about Christ as being the only true Christian, it's not to say that everybody else is wasting their time, in my opinion. It's more to say that that's how it's supposed to be. He is supposed to be the true Christian, and we're supposed to, or people that follow Christianity, or use him as a beacon of morality with a capital M. If you read Nietzsche, you'll know what I mean by that. Is that we should fulfill our life according to the same principles, right? So an example of that is something that Peterson actually said in one of his lectures. I can't remember which one, and he was talking about the Passion of Christ, and he said, and it was beautifully put, he said a lot of people think about Christ as going through the tragedy, right? The tragedy of the worst possible thing happening to the best possible example of existence, right? Regardless of your religious affiliation or thoughts, we can't deny, or it's very difficult for one to deny, that if you were sat opposite somebody who said, the don't kill each other, you know, don't hurt each other, be nice to each other, don't commit adultery, you know, don't just love your friend, also love your enemies, turn the other cheek. Someone said all these nice things, beautiful things, and I mean that with respect, because they're much deeper than nice. But if somebody said this to you, somebody sat next to you in a pub or somebody you met in the street, you won't turn around and think, what an awful, evil person. You would think, what a really nice person, right? So I think that's worth thinking about in itself, because a lot of people deny Christ, but the idea of Christ is it's not something you can deny, because it's just a myth or a story or a person, or however you see it. It was something expressing something we should do really well, which is to be better humans, right? So you then think about the tragedy, and the tragedy is the worst possible thing happening to the best possible entity. In this case, the crucifixion, right? So the crucifixion was even the mob went against Christ. He was crucified in front of the mob who said they loved him, and they let a Barabbas is his name, I think. They let a barbarian type of person, a very awful person, free instead of somebody who was just a perfect human, if you like, right? And then he was also crucified naked, and obviously they don't show that, but crucifixion was done naked, and it was the worst form of capital punishment at that time, in front of his mother, in front of Mary Magdalene, Mother Mary, in front of his closest friends who also denied him. And that's not the story, and Peterson puts it very beautifully. He said the story is not that, the story is the passion. The story of Christ is not the crucifixion, it's the resurrection. Okay, and that's representative of coming through darkness with light. With light, I don't know if that's the right phrase, right? But finding the light in the darkness. And again, some great examples. I think it was Jonathan Paggio said in one of his podcasts with Peterson, he said the darkest time of the year is, you know, December, mid-December, late December, and that's also the time we put the lights on, isn't it? The fairy lights, the Christmas lights, we put the lights on in the darkest times, and it's massively representative of Christ, and you know, the fact that he said, well, the Bible states, he said God uttered the phrase, let there be light, right? So I could go into a certain segue, but I won't. I just want to focus on Peterson. So what he's talking about there, I guess, is the true connection of how that narrative plays out in reality. And you get emotional, because I get emotional anyway, because the closer you get to the truth, the more aligned you've become with true beauty. So you really understand what true beauty is, and it is love. So the closer you get to the truth, the more you realize that it's the plus, not the minus, that wins. It's the matter over antimatter. It's the existence over non-existence, which is also the notion of the Big Bang, right? Because something was created out of nothing. So there's always a manifestation of an entity, and that happens to be matter, which some people believe is God. Anyway, without going into that direction, it's really interesting that Peterson thinks about how that plays out in life, and it gets him emotional, because when you see a myth or a story or something that's been told a billion trillion times through various religions, there's 4,200 and something religions in the world, right? But the story keeps being told and told and told. People keep believing it, and people keep challenging it. People keep believing it, people keep challenging it. People in almost every pub it's been discussed, right? But then you see it play out in front of you, and you realize it's always been there, and it's never forced its hand to prove itself. It's always subtle. It's always, you see it in life, and you realize there are moments in life where you realize it's real. It is real. The story is real. There is something called a spirit, whether you think that's something within you or something that exists all around you. You see this in your life, and many people see it in different forms. And when you see it, it's overwhelming, because what that is doing is it's summarizing that the most spoken about argument in the existence of humanity, right, is what created us. And when you start to see notions of the answer to that, it can become very overwhelming. It's almost like a film. I remember, I think Carl Sagan had something to do with this film called Contact, where Sigourney Weaver, I think it was, goes into a different parallel universe or something, not different parallel, a parallel universe, and she sees a father walking down the beach, and the father says, "You can't tell anyone that you are here," and she says something like, "How can I experience this and not share it with someone?" That in itself is so difficult. And I think John Peterson was going through that there in that video a little bit. It's something he's realized and seen in his existence, and it's overwhelming that when he tries to tell people it, that they're not going to believe him because they think it's just words, but he knows. And Carl Jung actually very famously says in one of his videos, said, "Do you believe in God?" And he goes, "As a child, maybe. Believe? I don't need to believe because I know. That's what he says, and that's one of the last videos, you can watch it on YouTube, that Carl Jung made. He says, "I know, I don't need to believe." Anyway, I'm not here to preach God, I'm just here to give my insight into that video, which I hope was helpful. If not, I apologize. Thank you.